Greetings and salutations. I am Kevin DeYoung, and I am not joined, as always, by my good friends Justin Taylor and Colin Hanson. Many apologies. I am recording this on September 7, Labor Day, a holiday here in the United States. And Colin and Justin, selfish creatures they are not joining me. They are doing something better, no doubt. Don't worry, I am not doing this all day, and I will take some time off and spend some time with my family. Many projects to do on this beautiful day in Charlotte, but I am holding down the fort, and so you are going to have a shorter Life and Books and Everything, and it is going to be a solo venture, but hopefully there'll still be something that can help you pass the time on your commute or mowing the lawn. I ought to mention that we are sponsored again by Crossway, so grateful for their partnership on the podcast. And want to mention the book Unfolding Grace, 40 Guided Readings Through the Bible. Great book for discovering the unifying story of Scripture from cover to cover through 40 different Scripture readings. Each passage with newly written introductions will enable readers to follow God's redemptive plan as it develops throughout the Bible. There are 40 illustrations, study guides available. Unfolding Grace, 40 Guided Readings Through the Bible. Thank you, Crossway, and check out that book. This is going to be shorter than usual, but let's talk first about books. I am always going through books, and I should hasten to add, because lest people give me too much credit, I do read a lot of books. There's lots of other things I don't do. Reading is one of the things I do, but I read books in many different ways, and so often I will read the introduction carefully, I'll read a conclusion carefully, and depending on the book, I may plow through some of the middle section or skim through some of the middle section. So I don't want you to think that every book that I ever mention is meticulously, laboriously read line by line. Some parts are read more quickly than others. But let me just mention 4 books that I have finished lately. A couple of these I mentioned before because I was going to read them over the summer, and now I have finished them. So I'm just going to take them in the order that they're sitting in front of me, which means nothing to you because you can't see me. But this is a little book by Michael Strain. You could read it in an hour or two. It's called The American Dream is Not Dead, but Populism Could Kill It. Now, sort of unfortunately for Mr. Strain, this book comes out and then a global pandemic sends the economy crashing. But the basic arguments, and I've heard an interview with him where he maintains the basic arguments still stand, that the American dream is not dead. The cover of the book has a chart, a graph with an upward slope to it, and that chart forms one of the central arguments in the book as he looks at wages for typical American workers. And you'll have to get through all of the economic speak and the inflationary adjustment that he uses and the sort of workers he's looking at. He's looking at production and non-supervisory employees. So he's trying to think of workers, maybe blue collar, but just workers and their wages. And his argument, which I find convincing, is that for typical workers, wages have risen 34% over the past 3 decades. That is adjusted for inflation. Now, he is clear that there is much room for improvement. It's clear that this increase in pay has been more at the top end of the economic spectrum. But he wants to make the point, and I think it's an important one, that the American dream is not dead. And by that he means economic mobility. So he has a number of statistics in here. 7 Americans out of every 100 raised in the bottom 20% of the income reach the top 20%. 3/4 of Americans have higher inflation-adjusted family incomes than did their parents. 86% of Americans who are raised in the bottom 20% have higher family incomes than did their parents. So he's making the case that there still is economic upward mobility. And one of the reasons he thinks this is important is because he argues that on both the right and the left now, if you listen to almost any political candidate, the description they will give you is not one of hope and optimism or growth or dreams fulfilled, but rather crashing, burning, nightmares, degeneracy, and dreams falling short. And he wants to say that can give the impression that things are only getting worse. Greg Easterbrook, we've mentioned a book by him before. The book, not mindfulness, but factfulness, often makes also makes the same case that actually things are not all getting worse, and in fact, by just economic measures and standard of living measures, which as Christians we know are not the most important measures, but they matter, things actually have been getting better. And so the payoff in Strain's book, he says, if you are bombarded with this message that it's only a nightmare all the time, and in particular, then you hear from both the right and the left that it's because entirely of forces outside of your control colluding against you, you begin to believe that you have no agency and that others are always to blame. So he says this could be the elites or immigrants or the wealthy or the game is rigged or free trade or capitalism. And he wants to make the argument that, in fact, there is much reason to have optimism. Now, he's very clear that many economic factors are not as good as they ought to be and not as good as they always have been in American history. But his argument, the American dream is not dead. Good little book to perhaps give you something to think about. A second book, I mentioned this before the summer break, by F.H. Buckley, called The Morality of Laughter. He is a professor of law at George Mason University, at least he was at the time of the dust jacket that I'm reading. The Morality of Laughter. It's actually an academic and somewhat technical book looking at two different theories, one called the normative theory and one called the positive theory, on what makes laughter laughter. But here's the big idea in the book. He argues that laughter always reveals the laugher's sense of superiority to a butt, to someone who is thereby degraded. Now, this doesn't have to be a real harsh degradation. It could be, it's a joke. It could be in jest. It could be that everyone is laughing and there's nothing mean-spirited about it. But he's arguing that there is always someone or something that is the butt of a joke. And in the act of laughing, even if it's self-deprecating humor, that the laugher is indicating some sense of superiority over the object about which they are laughing. Now, I have to admit, I'm not sure I find the technicalities of that argument entirely convincing, but it's a new field. I'm not a scholar of laughter, and so I could kind of take it or leave it on the academic thesis itself. But what certainly is very instructive and helpful in the book is the recurring point that laughter almost always has as its underlying principle some vision of morality. That those who make us laugh, and when we laugh, we are upholding some set of comic norms. Quote, our laughter identifies a set of comic vices, and the sting of laughter contains its own sanction for transgressors. That's why the book is called The Morality of Laughter. I enjoyed the book. Enjoy is too strong a word. I benefited from the book, and it has been something I've thought about over the years. I'm not saying whether my family or friends think that I'm funny, but I have always enjoyed a good laugh. I've always enjoyed a joke that makes people laugh, and it was a struggle with me for many years, feeling like being the funny person or the person who likes to laugh is less spiritual. And if I were truly godly and more spiritual and more holy, I would be more resolutely serious all the time. And I've come to see that so much of that is dependent upon God given personalities and temperaments. And people who are very serious are often very serious about most everything. And so they need to be challenged to find mirth and to find even jocularity. And those, like a Spurgeon, who was often using humor in the pulpit, warned against a irreverent humor and irreverent jocularity. And so that's a caution for those who like to laugh and like to make people laugh, that they don't make other people in a nasty way the butt of their jokes. But this book makes the compelling case that we need laughter, and laughter serves a good purpose, not only because it feels good to smile and to laugh, but there is an underlying sense of morality in laughter. And it is something that brings not only zest to life, but brings ethical bearings on life. What we find funny, what we laugh at, says something about our values, our virtues, and our vices. Third book, which I also mentioned, I believe, before the summer break, by Jason Josephson Storm. The myth, of disenchantment, magic, modernity, and the birth of the human sciences. The myth of disenchantment. What he means is that in the modern world, supposedly, we no longer deal with superstition, or he often uses the all-encompassing word magic, which doesn't mean illusionist. It can mean that, doesn't mean necessarily David Copperfield. He's using it in a bigger meta sense of magic. And he's arguing that to say that modernity has meant a complete disenchantment, we no longer have superstition, we no longer have magic, we no longer have alchemy, even if it's named something different, he says is a myth. He begins with Paris, 1907, Marie Curie, famous scientist, who is sitting there at a seance. He talks about Francis Bacon. Bacon. The father, as it were, of empiricism and leading to the scientific method. And he explains that Bacon was very interested in alchemy and brought to many of his intellectual pursuits findings from the occult. So he's not trying to say that Bacon was good or bad. He's just saying it's a myth to think that we suddenly reached the modern period and the Enlightenment, and now we have a complete disenchantment. He's not arguing one way or the other. This is not a Christian book. He says at the end that he's rather ambivalent about it. And on the one hand, he's thankful for science and what the modern world has given. So he's not saying if only we could be enchanted again. What he's really saying is we never became disenchanted. He makes the interesting point that in anthropology, for example, it has become absolutely taboo that an anthropologist would look at some tribesmen somewhere and describe them as primitive. You can't talk about primitive people. That would be very un-PC. And yet he says, in effect, that is how all of anthropology works, but not with tribes people, but with modernity. And people who existed before modernity, most academics have no problem thinking of them as primitive people and look at their belief in the supernatural, and they must have been superstitious or they were enthusiasts. And then comes the modern period where people now believe in science rather than in these traditional animistic or religious senses of the world around them. And so it's a helpful book, if nothing else, in the big idea that modernity and its disenchantment is a myth. And he has lots of examples of that. And it's helpful for us to remember as Christians that we, of all people, inherit a view of the world that is in one sense going to be irrefutably modern, whether we like it or not, but also believes, we ought to resolutely believe, in the existence of the supernatural, the unexplainable. And it's not hard to show how, even if traditional religious beliefs in the supernatural are declining, at the same time, you have all sorts of other enchanted, magical beliefs that are on the rise, whether it's with conspiracy theories or extraterrestrials or any number of theories. In other words, we are undeniably and will always be an enchanted people, to use the language of this author. And to think that we put it behind us is a mistake. And then finally, here's a fourth book, J. Gresham Machen, a biographical memoir by Ned Stonehouse, who, of course, was one of the young faculty that Machen brought to the founding of Westminster and went on to be a well known writer and outstanding New Testament scholar himself. And Ned Stonehouse wrote this biographical memoir. So, this, I've read over many years to come. Now, I'm not telling you which of those four I think is the best way to approach voting. I do think that all of them can be justified, not theologically, of course, but they're logical, and there can be a moral coherence to them. Vote for the best candidate. Period. Vote for the best of the two parties, two candidates that will be president. Third, the first two, but with a basic threshold of character or moral decency, or the fourth, thinking not just for the next 4 years, but long term, what is going to best serve the interests of the party you adhere to most, or the country and the aims that you have for it, for the church, and for human flourishing. So again, I'm not telling you, I didn't even mention any candidate. Just saying, let's have the argument, even sometimes before we get to the who. Let's talk about what is the nature of voting, because often we're firing at one another and we're really arguing about, well, what is it that we're doing when we vote? And we're assuming one of these ways as better than another, or one of these approaches to voting as godlier than another, and then we come at each other with the full force and all barrels, when what we're really arguing about is, how do we understand voting? And that's not as simple as it sounds. Let's take another issue. I've written a lot about race, and want to narrow it down to talk about police shootings. And I should say here that I'm going solo, as you know, and Justin and Colin aren't here, and Justin and Colin are very good friends. We agree on most things. We don't agree, you can tell, on every single thing, and that makes for healthy friendship and healthy discussion. So in all of these points here that I'm making, I don't know if Colin and Justin would agree with me on all of this, or where they might demur. But let's just focus on police shootings, which are in the news, and it seems likely will continue to be in the news, sadly, for the foreseeable future. It's very, very difficult to think that in a country this size, there aren't, you're not going to have videotaped on someone's phone some shooting that seems either questionable or seems outright heinous. So it's going to be in our public purview. And when we talk about these things, it brings to bear a lifetime, sometimes centuries of racial tension and difficulty and sin and guilt. So we're almost never just talking about this particular incident. But I do think it's important. Come, let us reason together to try to think through these things as Christians. 4 questions that I would ask anytime we see one of these police shootings. What happened? How often does it happen? To whom does it happen? Why does it happen? Again, Christians are going to disagree, and they're going to get their news from other sources, and they're going to scour the internet and find different understandings of how this happened. And even when the person may have their day in court, you still may not agree. So this isn't a panacea that we all just get along now. It's not a mythical third way, but I do think we owe it to one another in talking about these things, that we don't quickly elevate it to the highest level of rhetoric, so that any disagreement with one another on these matters means that you are wholly a pawn of the cultural Marxists, or you are basically a white supremacist and you don't care about race and you don't care about racism and you're enjoying your privilege. It seems to me but there's a good faith way to ask these 4 questions. The next time, heaven forbid, there's a next time where we see a shooting, an officer-involved shooting. What happened? We may not know exactly what happened. We may have one sense of what happened, and then later there's more information that tells us we didn't really have an accurate sense of what happened. But surely that's not an unimportant question. What actually happened here? Maybe the snippet recorded gives an accurate sense of what happened, or maybe it didn't. I'm not talking about obfuscating with questions so that we never have to own up to difficult situations, but it is important to actually understand what happened. And then how often does it happen? If what we see and we have a good sense of what happened, is this something that happens um, hundreds of times a day, hundreds of times a year, thousands of times a week? How often is this? Because it will be brought to our attention and it will sear the mind and the imagination with such a force that it may or may not accurately reflect how often these things happen and to whom does it happen. Meaning, we is it only to black people? Is it to black and white people? Is it black, white and Hispanic? Is it to men, to women? Is it in uh, basic proportion with the population? Is it in basic proportion with the rates of violent crime? To whom does it happen? Now, I know that even asking these questions can sound insensitive. I don't mean it to be that. And I understand that some, just say some white Christians may want to throw an endless stream of questions to never really get to the place of empathy or grief. At the same time, there must be a place to legitimately try to come together and say what we are disagreeing about may not be what the Bible says about racism. It may not be a love for justice. It may be about what happened, how often does it happen, to whom does it happen, and then the fourth question: why does it happen? Why do the thing? There's many possible explanations. And I think it's worth asking the question: is it because of racism? Is it because of poor training? Is it because of human error in a stressful situation? Is it because someone reached for a weapon? Is it because um, bad apple? Is it because of systemic problems? Is it because of the way that law enforcement officers view minorities? The why, I don't believe, can just be presumed. That is, that we know the answer automatically to the why. So when we talk about these racially charged police shootings, yes, tensions run high, emotions run high, and we have real important disagreements and real important things are at stake. But let's try to look at what is it that we may be disagreeing on. What are the arguments that need to be made? And again, make the arguments, but understand that we're making arguments about what happened, how it happened, why it happened, to whom it happened, how often it happened, which can be made by people who share the same theological convictions and commitments, but maybe approach or maybe answer some of those questions differently. Okay, finally, coronavirus. If you're in a church, chances are your church has experienced some level of contention, division, whether mild to extreme, based on your church's approach to COVID-19. Do you defy government orders and open up? How do you insist on people wearing masks? Is it a hard insistence? Is it a soft insistence? Do you provide an area for people in the sanctuary if they don't want to wear masks? Are you really encouraging your people to come back? Are you leaning on sovereignty? And if you trust God's sovereignty, why wouldn't you be here? If you love worship, why wouldn't you be here? Or are you leaning on, if you love your neighbor, then you're going to wear a mask and you're going to be very careful around people who may have underlying conditions? So just to highlight the questions or the issues is not to answer all of that, but I think it can at least focus our attention to understand what we're really talking about and why often we are arguing in theological terms when the real disagreement comes down to what you think about the virus. And the Bible's not going to tell you the nature of the coronavirus. So, again, just fours. I had 4 ways of voting, 4 questions. Here are 4 questions, I think, when it comes to coronavirus that we at least have to be honest about. 1, is the virus a very serious health concern, or has the threat been greatly exaggerated? That gets to the heart of the matter. That's what we're arguing about. 2, is the government exercising its authority in consistent ways, or does it seem to be singling out churches for worse treatment? 3rd question, is the government trying to achieve its ends in the best or in the least burdensome way, or are its rules arbitrary and unreasonably heavy-handed? A 4th question, is the government to be trusted as sincerely, even if imperfectly, looking out for the best interest of its citizens, or is the government ramping up oppressive measures that they will be slow to relinquish? So you're going to think different things, and I think there are better and worse answers, and some of you are frustrated. Okay, you're giving us the questions. You're not telling us what you think. Maybe another time. What I'm trying to do here is simply isolate that I've seen too often Christians talking past each other on COVID-19, trying to bring to bear, and they're coming with the force of Scripture and theology, and that's great. But what I really see is, you know what? You've assumed I shouldn't say assume. That's not fair. They may have come to their own mind a reasoned conclusion, but what they are presenting looks as if it's an assumed position on whether COVID is very serious or whether it's greatly exaggerated, on whether the government is really looking out for our best interest or whether the government, this is just a step toward oppressive measures, and once you wear a mask, they're never going to tell you to take the mask off. So by focusing our attention on what the issues are, at least we have maybe some hope that we can, if not agree, we can at least see the nature of our disagreements. And I think it's really important on all of these very divisive, cultural flashpoint, difficult issues right now that we try to think as clearly as possible. So what's the takeaway of all of this? Okay, very helpful, or actually not helpful. You've given us some questions to ask, and now I just know why I'm so mad at everyone. Well, let me just land this plane with maybe a few takeaway thoughts. One, and this is what I've been saying all along, let's be clear about what we are arguing. So let's try to isolate the actual disagreement. What we're really disagreeing about is whether, for example, police officer shootings happen disproportionately to African Americans. What we're arguing about is a statistical finding. That's not all of it. You can't separate the personal from it. Or what we are arguing about is whether the COVID numbers are accurate or they've overcounted or they're undercounted. See, what's so difficult is if we're arguing about A, B, and C, we think, but we're actually arguing about X, Y, and Z. So let's be clear. What are we actually arguing about? Maybe a second takeaway is, surely as Christians, we ought to be less dogmatic about these things than we are about articles of the Christian faith. Less dogmatic doesn't mean you haven't researched, you don't try to persuade, but if we are more passionate and more dogmatic about our reading of someone's vote, what it means, or reading a officer involved shooting, or our understanding of epidemiology. We're more dogmatic about those things than we are about the articles of faith in the Apostles' Creed. Then something is wrong. There should be, it's a different level of knowledge and certainty. And then, lest you think that I'm just saying, hey, we just ask questions and that's all we do have to be honest, third, that likely you will have to come to some conclusions about these contentious matters. Likely you already have some thought in your head, perhaps unarticulated, about these matters, about how you view voting, about how you assess when you see another shooting, or how you have assessed the danger or lack thereof with COVID-19. So yes, you it's going to be hard in today's world to live your life without some sense of conclusion on those matters. So at least be honest with it. Read well, listen to people who disagree, do your best. Almost none of us are going to be experts in any of those areas, and we can't forestall any conclusions unless we're absolute experts. We understand that. But then when we have made a decision, or we have come to a conclusion, let's hold it somewhat tentatively, knowing it's not an article of the faith, our understanding, and then try to persuade and try to listen, try to learn. And then here's a final thought, and I'm thinking as a pastor, understand, I'm speaking to congregation members out there, understand that most pastors, certainly not all, but most pastors are going to try to split the difference when it comes to these contentious issues, these prudential matters. Now, splitting the difference sounds negative, and it can be. It could be that your pastor or me, I'm a pastor of a local church, are just cowardly trying to take a weasel way out, how not to make people upset. Don't want to come to a real decision, don't want to really make any waves, and so just going to try to find a third way. I'm just going to say, is there a way that's sort of the golden mean between these? So yeah, there's a bad way to do this, and there's a bad motivation for it. But it may also be that your pastor is trying as best as he can to shepherd a flock with diverse viewpoints and understandings and different access to knowledge and different sources of media input, and is trying as wisely and as graciously as possible to not have the whole place blow up. And that, I think, is a commendable aim by the pastor. So typically, on these matters, most pastors will try to find, is there a way to try to hold this together? So that means that you're likely not to find, again, you can think of other examples, but you're likely not to find pastors who have extreme views in these matters, or at least extreme views that they're stating extremely explicitly. And now contrast that with most of the media input we're getting are going to be the strongest, most strident voices, because those are the people who are entertaining. Those are the people who get followers. Those are the people who get shows. Those are the people that get our attention. And so you have this uneasy equilibrium. It's not even an equilibrium, where you have folks who are most passionate about it, and they're the ones you're going to hear the most from. And many of the voices they're getting are probably the most trenchant, strident voices, where the pastor and the leader in many organizations or institutions is going to try to find a way that holds the constituency, as it were, together. All of that means, pastors, let's have appropriate courage and let's have appropriate wisdom. And Christians, let's be appropriately patient, and let's all of us do our spirit-led best to set the world an example in thinking carefully about these things. Not afraid to state opinions strongly. I know the tone police are out there. No. You can state our opinions strongly. But we ought to state the most important opinions the most strongly. And that means that some other less dogmatic convictions and conclusions, we will have a bit more epistemic humility and perhaps grace toward one another as we seek to learn. Well, I said this was going to be short, and wouldn't you know, this pastor can monologue very well for nearly an hour. Looking forward to have Colin and Justin back next week. And thank you for listening. Thank you again to Crossway. Thank you for subscribing and checking us out on leaving a review, only if it's good, on one of the many platforms. And thanks for being with us. Until next time, glorify God, enjoy Him forever, and read a good book.